I was enraged. I was a mess. I just can't describe what goes through your mind. You can hear so much about your daughter, and then finally it gets to the point where you want to pop somebody. She's dead, but why?
I just remember my heart beating very loudly, and he said, somebody murdered our baby. My friend told me, you kept screaming and screaming and screaming, murdered, murdered. Everything just went blank, and I was like a zombie.
We were working day and night to try to solve this case. We were very concerned about the possibility that we had a killer that was out there just randomly shooting people. I want to get the shooter, the person who pulled the trigger that ended the lives of these two young girls. That's who I want.
This is the outfit my sister was killed in. I was such a little whole kid, just destroy somebody and kill them. 27 years. And I dream about it, and I have nightmares about it. Like it happened yesterday. It was horrible. You see this on TV. You don't see this in a little town of Bethlehem. This is our family photo of the four of us. And the joke was always that we were so poor that my dad used to use a bowl to cut our hair. So we all used to have the same haircut except for Jen. Jen always had ponytails, but the rest of us, unfortunately, had bowl haircuts. Just makes me sad, because we were always so happy. We did everything together. Till the day she died, everybody was still friends and still together. We're all still together except for her. On the night of June 29th, my bedroom door was thrown open. My boyfriend and I were sleeping when the men came through the door with the flashlight and gun pointed at us. My daughter's crib was right there. They turned into the room. The gun was pointing at the crib. At which point I panicked. I was like, what's going on? Like, what are you doing? I remember saying that. What are you doing? Why do you have that near my daughter? And he was like, get up, get out of bed. We want everybody downstairs right now. Like, holy heck, who's running through my house? You know, what is this? Nobody was allowed to talk. They made my whole entire family meet in the living room. And they had my dad at gunpoint. It was like a scene out of a horror movie. Like you see this stuff on TV, but never do you live it. And we lived it. I didn't know if it was a robbery. No clues. They did identify themselves as Bethlehem police officers, but when you're awoken like that, till you start understanding everything that was going on, you didn't know too much. There was, I think, 3 detectives were there, many uniformed cops were there, and they had my house surrounded. They just told us something had happened, and Jen was involved, and they needed to gather information. So we sat in the living room for a long time, just asking questions like, you know, who were you with tonight? You know, what car did you drive? My mother was at work. The only one who was missing that night was my sister. It was horrible.
June 29th, well, it was a regular day for me. I got up and I went to work. I worked at the Bethlehem Steel, and then I had a part-time job tending bar. When I got home after bartending, it was late at night, probably around 2 o'clock. I didn't see my wife's car, so I figured she went to work. I was assuming that all my children were home when I got home. I wound up falling asleep on the sofa. I was woken up with a 45 at my head. There was 3 cops with their guns drawn, pointed at me. Then the one went up through the house, got up the kids. They all came down. My wife's not there, or my daughter Jennifer, and I said, there's something going on, what's going on? He says, well, my wife's supposed to be working, I don't know where my daughter's at, because I got home late, and I'm assuming she was in bed. It's a weird feeling, you're frantic. We asked where Jennifer's at, and then they finally come and told us that she was killed up at the lookout, but they didn't say how or why. I was very confused. There was a panic in all of us. We were kind of like dumbstruck, really.
June 29th, 1995, I remember that my wife and I were sleeping, and my phone went off, and I was notified that we had a homicide up at the Lehigh Lookout. The Lookout is a very scenic area that overlooks the city of Bethlehem. It can be a draw for young people, teenagers, to just sort of hang out. It's secluded. When I pulled into the Lookout, the police were already starting processing at a crime scene. My first step was to stop to talk with the coroner. He was able to tell me that there were 2 victims. The first was a young girl who was laying face down on the other side of the wall where you might sit to look out over the city of Bethlehem. She had a gunshot wound in the back. There were some fast food stuff on the wall which suggested that she probably was sitting there at the time she was shot. I walked down the hill a little bit. It wasn't very far where the sports car was parked. In the back seat was another body of a young girl. The theory was, based on the blood droppings and also where the gun casings were left, that it appears she probably ran from the initial point bleeding and then probably tried to get in the car to get away, perhaps, or to protect herself, lock the doors, and then probably died in there because of gunshot wounds. This is a photograph of Mary and Jennifer. I haven't seen this photograph for a long time, and it's very sad. I remember looking at the autopsy of these 2 girls. I mean, they were just so young, you know, and seeing them on a slab with bullet wounds, it's really tough to take. I don't think that there was any working theory at that time, but when I see people shot in the back, essentially, that means they were ambushed. The ballistics showed us that there was only 1 firearm for both victims, which suggests 1 shooter. Homicides are personal. They usually have some kind of motive. And we were concerned that here we were in an isolated area with 2 girls who were young, 17 and 15. And we're thinking, is there somebody in these forests, in the area, you know, with a rifle, with a gun? We really did not know. And we were very concerned about the possibility that we had a killer that was out there just randomly shooting people.
This was Christmas a few years ago with my husband, Carl, myself, and my 4 children. Back in '95, things were pretty good. Everybody was healthy and happy. I worked with children with disabilities. I'd spend the night with them, get them up in the morning, dress them, give them breakfast, and make sure they got off to school. I think it was 5:30. I heard a knock at the door. I was thinking, who's knocking at the door at 5:30 in the morning? I just remember my heart beating very loudly. And I went to answer the door, and when I opened it, my husband and my co-worker were standing there. I could see they had been crying. I don't know why. I said, just don't tell me something happened to my Jennifer. And that always bothered me because I would have been just as concerned if it was Melanie or my boys. They kept shaking their heads. They wouldn't say. I thought maybe a car accident. I said, all right, Carl, let me get my purse and we'll go to the hospital. And Carl just looked me right in the eye and he said, no. He said, somebody murdered our daughter. No, somebody murdered our baby. My friend told me, she said, you could have heard you in the next county. You kept screaming and screaming and screaming, murdered, murdered. We went to police headquarters and we walked in there. You could have heard a pin drop. There must have been 5 or 6 officers at their desks. Nobody was saying a word. I kept saying, what happened? What happened? Nobody would answer us. We were fingerprinted. They told us to sit down. Still, I didn't know what happened. Carl didn't know what happened. It was a very hectic day. I didn't see Jennifer except when she came home from work and we bumped into each other and she asked, what's for supper? Well, there was no supper that day, so this is why I said to her, I'm just gonna have to give you some money and you'll have to pick up some fast food or something to eat tonight. And I said, you may use my car. Right away her face. Within an hour, the incident happened and they were dead. I was sitting there waiting. I kept thinking, oh my God, I gave her the car. She was in a car accident. They're young, they're girls. Were they raped? And an officer came out. He knew us. He said, I know these people. They're my neighbors. He said, those were good girls. These are good people. I'm going to tell you what happened to the girls. He said they were both shot and killed. Everything just went blank. And I was like a zombie. It never crossed my mind that they were shot. They didn't elaborate on much. They told us we could go home and they would get in touch with us.
after we left the police station, we still didn't really know what happened. You call the police station every day, and you get basically the same answer. We can't give out any information because the case is pending. I read the newspaper. It told us that there was a murder-suicide, and they were saying Jennifer shot Mary and then killed herself. And it really upset me knowing my daughter, no, that ain't her, and it really pissed me off, per se, that they wrote something like that. I was enraged. I was a mess. I just can't describe what goes through your mind. To me, the news media sucks because they were trying to pick the worst out of my daughter. No matter where you went, the media, they were there, the people knocking at your doors. You can hear so much about your daughter, and then finally it gets to the point where you want to pop somebody. This is when I finally went out to greet all the reporters that were standing around the house, looking for answers. Well, they were outside, they were calling, they were knocking on the door, asking for interviews and stuff. And I just finally said to my wife, I guess it's time somebody's got to go out, so I guess I'm the one. So I went out and approached them. Well, to me it was, first of all, it's like an overwhelming thing to have all these people here. But it's frustrating because Joe here's asking a question, and this guy's answering a question, and other guy's asking a question. They have microphones, and so they can hear you. They're shoving it in your face and stuff, and it wasn't the best of times talking to them. But I had to do it. They said Jennifer owed a lot of money to people for drugs, and really that upset me. Because she wasn't into drugs like they said that she was. They even come up with she owed somebody $500 or something. And I said, no, I don't believe so. And I showed her that she had more money in her bank account than I did. So I knew it wasn't drugs. She's dead, but why? They wanted to know. And I said, we don't know. I said, that was it. I couldn't do no more. And I went back inside.
Was it somebody didn't like her? Was it meant for me? I asked myself that in the beginning many times because we look so much alike. Was it meant for me? The cops made me to believe that I should just be extra careful because they didn't know. They didn't know they were coming after the family. I was followed by a police officer. They sat outside of our house. They followed me to work. I looked over my shoulder. The cops questioned my friends. They questioned my neighbors. They questioned everybody. You started blaming your family members. You started blaming cousins. You started blaming your friends. My mom started blaming my dad. My dad would blame my mom. I didn't know if my dad did it. I didn't know if my mom did it. It was horrible. You see this on TV. You don't see this in a little town of Bethlehem.
There were lots of rumors going around that this was a killing because one of the girls owed drug money. We never really established any of that. They were pretty much average high school kids. We did a lot of background work on both of them. We came up with nothing to suggest that they were involved in anything other than normal teenage activities. These are two young kids, 15, 17 years old, minding their own business, sitting on a wall, enjoying a summer evening, eating French fries and drinking a soda. And someone shoots these girls from behind, and no one can say why. We really did not know. and we were very concerned about the possibility that we had a killer that was out there just randomly shooting people. We have a serial killer, we have random shootings. There was a lot of fear in the area. My office got flooded with phone calls, so did Bethel Police. We normally try to put the community at ease by saying, there's no need to fear, but in this case, we couldn't say that.
When it came time to burying my sister, my mom just wasn't up to it. She wasn't up to picking out her outfit. She just wasn't up to, she went away on us. Mentally, she was gone. So I remember picking out her outfit. My sister was like a tomboy. And, you know, everybody normally, oh, you bury him in a dress, you bury him like that. And I'm not gonna bury my sister in something she wasn't gonna be comfortable. Because I knew she'd probably come back and haunt me if I buried her in a dress. I dressed her in her favorite outfit that she wore quite often. She had on her favorite pair of jeans and her vest that she wore. And we did her hair the way she always had it done. Sucked. I didn't want to pick it. I wanted to pick out her graduation outfit. I didn't want to pick out an outfit she was going to be buried in.
The grief, it took over me. I was more worried about myself, grieving, and not worrying about my children at all, or my wife. I go up in my room and I just stay in there for a while, or I go up to Jennifer's room and sit there and ask her why. No parent should have to bury their child at all. We checked in with the police every day for a couple of weeks to find out what's going on. Every day we got the same answer. They still haven't found a killer yet. And then you say, well, when is this going to happen? It's just a waiting game.
I couldn't get any peace. I had no peace of mind. I just wanted to know who did this. I did get the courage to go up to where it happened. That was hard. It was emotional. I kept visualizing what happened. There was a little car there, and two young men were there. And I said, did you know the girls? And they said, yes, they did. And I didn't recognize them. I didn't know them. I said, oh, I was Jennifer's mother. I said, it's terrible what happened here. And then they said, yes, it was, and we're sorry. They got in the car and left. I didn't know who they were at the time. I just thought they were just passerbys.
Is it possible the girls knew their killer? I thought so. And the reason why I thought so is because generally, you know, I go with statistics. Most time people do know. It's very rare that you have random shootings. So the odds were that this was in the circle of friendships of these girls. There was someone that they knew. That's what we thought. The very first starting point is family friends. We started to trace the friendships of these girls. It took a lot of interviews. It was not easy, and it took the police months. There was a lot of people who felt that he was the guy that we should be looking at, and he was one of the first people that we interviewed. He was not overly helpful. Not that he was necessarily lying, although we believe that there may have been some of that going on too. Very early in the investigation, he got in contact with a public defender who basically stonewalled the police in terms of trying to give any information. He sort of made himself look more guilty by doing that. Boyfriends do kill their girlfriends. But at that point, we had no evidence that he did anything wrong. It was just weird that he would, go to a public defender at that point. He wasn't charged with anything. He wasn't really being accused of anything. His name surfaced early as someone that was in the circle, but there wasn't any obvious connection between him and these two girls. So we came back to him again. He was 18, bouncing around pretty much on his own, staying at friends' houses, not working, didn't have a great relationship with his family. I called him sort of a drifter. He had had some crimes of theft and things of that nature in his background as a juvenile. So, we just really have a lot of information on him at that point. When they brought him in, he denied being at the lookout, never was up that area, gave some alibi that he was with two other young boys. We didn't have anything on him. We had to sort of put him off to the side and continue with the investigation. When you have an unsolved homicide like this, two young girls shot, no one can explain why, there's no obvious evidence of motive, in an area such as this lookout, which is a secluded area, it puts a lot of pressure on the police and the prosecutor to try to solve it. We were working day and night to try to solve this case. It was a top priority. We'd have team meetings just about every single day. I would be down either in the morning, sometimes in the morning and the afternoon, for updates. Who'd you talk to? What do you think? Where's it leading to? And that's the way it went on for the summer. In early December of 1995, police investigators tell me that Mary's boyfriend wanted to reach out, that he had some additional information to share with the police. The boyfriend of Mary Orlando now is telling us that the victims were going to go meet Christopher Bissey that evening. This is important information because it puts Bissey, who's now, a suspect that we're looking at, in the presence of the victims.
So this is the outfit my sister was killed in. Somebody asked me the other day, why, my daughter, Mommy, why are you holding on to that? I don't know. And I look at the tiniest hole, and how such a little hole can just destroy somebody and kill them. 27 years. And I dream about it, and I have nightmares about it, like it happened yesterday.
The name of Christopher Bissey kept coming into our view. No one seemed to know who he was in relationship with Jennifer Grider and Mary Orlando. He was not a friend of theirs. It's not clear how the girls knew Bissey, but it's the only evidence we have. So we brought in a number of his other friends, so-called friends, who said, oh, when the news hit about the girls, Bissey was bragging like I was up there, I was the one who did that. A lot of these friends dismissed it as just bravado, and he was acting cool and acting tough, and they hadn't come forward right away. They're young kids, afraid for whatever reasons they're going to get in trouble themselves, hanging around with the wrong crowd. One of them was the driver of the vehicle that Bissy was in, driving around with that evening. I think he was 18 at the time. And then we had another young boy who I believe was a little younger, maybe 15 or 16, who was a passenger. One of them, he had parents that I recall encouraged him to tell the truth. We interviewed the driver and passenger separately, and they gave almost identical statements as to what happened. The driver tells us that he's with himself, the passenger, Chris Bissy, driving around. At some point between 9 or 9:30, allegedly, Bissy tells him, you know, I want to go up to that lookout. He pulls in, he opens his window, he's looking around, and all of a sudden, he hears gunshots. He sees Bissy with his arm out the rear passenger side window, shooting at a girl that was sitting on the wall, and that he expressed as being in shock, basically, that like he was in shock. When Bissy gets out of the vehicle and walks towards the girl who was fleeing and shoots some more, he gets back in and tells the driver, let's go, we gotta go. According to the driver and the passenger, they then drive around a little bit more, and that they don't even discuss what happened. There's like silence about this, which is incredible. And then the driver goes home, and basically, as he puts it, tries to put this out of his mind. When they described how the shooting occurred, it matched where we found the casings, where the victims were. So they had to be there, because no one else would know what it looked like except people who were there that night. I could have charged all three with murder, but mere presence at the scene is not sufficient to make you guilty of a crime. Without them, I would have no case against the actual shooter. The boy who drove the car and the passenger, they didn't have the gun in their hand. I want to get the shooter, the person who pulled the trigger that ended the lives of these two young girls. That's who I want. Chris Bissy, he's the guy who pulled the trigger. I felt strongly that we had enough to charge, and so we made the decision to charge Bissy in early December.
It was in the middle of the night, around 4 o'clock in the morning, and it was the head detective, and he said, Joan, I just want to tell you we made an arrest. I was like stunned, and I remember saying, oh my God, who was it? I thought it was going to be somebody I knew. I was holding my breath, like, because I was scared to hear who it was going to be. And he said it was Chris Bissy. I said, I don't know who that is. I don't know where he came from. He didn't date Jennifer, he didn't date Mary, he didn't hang around with them. The detective said, I just want to tell you, it's out in the media. I'll guarantee you, in no time they're going to be there, and they're going to be all over your house, they're going to be coming. He said, I would advise, why don't you go somewhere? So we did. I got the kids, I got everybody up, and we got dressed. When I came out, they were everywhere. They were, you know, people with cameras and reporters with the microphones in my face. And did you know the person? Asking me 100 questions. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I had the baby in my arm, and I fell. I tripped and I fell. I was a mess. I was like, let me out of here. Let me get in my car. I just locked the doors and I left. Still, I didn't know what happened. Who was this Chris Bissy? Why would you shoot my daughter? My goal was to try to find out why he did it.
picture of Chris Bissy after he was arrested. He looked like an average Joe. He looked young and innocent, but I guess he wasn't. I got to know what he looked like. I got to know what hate means. As far as I'm concerned, I could put a bullet in and shoot him myself. It's a picture of a killer. Nothing more, nothing less. A no good piece of
Is who it turned out to be. And that's creepy to think that I was standing there talking to them all the time it was them.
These boys did not want to be cooperative. They were actually afraid of Bissy themselves. They didn't really want to testify, and we had to really, work on them and tell them how important it was, and one day there'll be citizens who will be able to look back and say, I helped the police solve a murder. The witnesses described that he started shooting from the vehicle and then got out of his car, walked down, and shot again the girl when she was trying to flee. Matched perfectly the ballistics. I would have no case without these eyewitnesses. I needed them. When I have to convince a jury, all 12 beyond a reasonable doubt, I'd like to give them a reason to say, here's why he killed this person. But we don't have them all the time. In my closing argument to the jury, I said, I can't tell you why. I can only tell you what happened. Mr. and Mrs. Grider live with this daily and the pain of it. And there's still unanswered questions for them. They want a reason. Yeah, they want to know why. Then it's up to the jury, 12 people. We don't know what they're going to do, and they all have to agree. It's not an easy burden, beyond a reasonable doubt, and all 12 people have to come to the same verdict. It was one of the hardest cases I've tried.
The day of the verdict, I remember them saying, Christopher Bissy, we find you guilty of first-degree murder. And I remember sitting there thinking my sister should come back now. I remember looking to the side where are you? Why aren't you back here with us? This is all done. This joke is over with. Why aren't you here with us? And it didn't change anything. At the time, I wanted the death penalty. He needs to fry. Let him die. But now, years later, I'm a mother. And I have 5 daughters. And people make mistakes. And you don't know if one of your children are going to make a mistake. So I'm very torn. Now I'm very torn. Who am I? I'm no better to have him killed. I'm no better. We'll let God deal with it. He destroyed my parents. Because I do everything to make my parents' life perfect. And I can't make it perfect because I can't bring her back. So this picture was of my sister. She took the babies to the Philadelphia Zoo. So this was probably 3 weeks before she passed away. It just hurts me that she's not here with them, because she would be spoiling them like crazy. And every little girl needs an aunt, and she doesn't have that. She would be that aunt that every time I would yell at my kids would run over to her house and hang out with her and be with her. She was always a jokester. Everybody always wanted to be around her. She would have been the fun aunt. I would have been the mean mom, and she was the fun aunt. This is the last known photo that I have of her. Chris Busy took so much from us. He doesn't realize how much he took from us. And to this day, I still want answers. I just wish he would tell us why. You know, so my parents could have some kind of closure.
I went to see Chris Busy. A lot of people did not think I should go. I did not go there to forgive him. I did not go there to excuse him. Just thinking that maybe something that he would say that I would pick up on. I walked in first and I sat there, then they brought him down. And I started crying. I don't know why, I think I was so nervous. I started crying and I just said, "You have no idea what you've done to my life, Miss, and especially my husband." I sat there for 7 hours with Chris Busy. He never once said he was sorry. He never showed any, like, feeling bad for me, or he just didn't care. Everything was denial. He didn't know the girls, and he had no idea what happened. He just lied. He just told so many lies. He said, "Well, first off, I want to tell you something. I never knew any girls from Bethlehem." He said, "I don't know anybody from Bethlehem." Lie. And then he got up and left the room, and I left the room, and that was the end of it. For 26 years, I've lived without knowing more. Unfortunately, I have lung cancer, and I'm facing a life-threatening operation. When all this happened, these were young kids. Well, I think there was a lot of teenagers that might have known what happened or what it was about. Now they're adults. Maybe they talk about it now. But doing this interview, maybe we'll get an answer out of it. Maybe somebody would say, you know, after all these years, my conscience bothers me. I do want to tell you, or I do remember something. And if things would work out for me, then I'll have some answers.
He's still alive, where my daughter is. They talk about how they have such bad prison, you know, the cells are bad and stuff. You know, I don't care. I mean, they did a crime, they gotta do the time. And like I say, their cells might be 8 by 10s, but my coffin, my daughter's in, is only 6 by 3, you know. So there's no room for her. But he's still kicking, so. I come here once a week, usually Saturday mornings. Well, it's his Holy Savior Cemetery. It's in Bethel, Pennsylvania. Especially because my daughter's here. It's just someone I can talk to without being ridiculed, you know, like someone, "Oh, you can't say that, or you shouldn't," you know. She just listens. It's good. Imagine a relationship if she was still alive. It's kind of hard because I think about that all the time. What would you be doing now, you know? Or how many kids would you have? How many grandkids would I have? You know, stuff like that. And I think about it all the time. It's always okay to cry around her. And I do sometimes. Sometimes I smile, sometimes I cry. But I'm there.
Min Kong the Viet Mot Kich Ban Dai Mo Phong Ban Tin Vuan Ko that Theo Kio Kai Tiat Diu Tra Hin Sun Hu Ban Yu Kor, Nhung Min Ko the Viet Fan One Kor Mot Kor Chuyen Crime Thriller Hu Kor Hone Tone, Dung Phong Kak Cinematic, Kang Thyng, Jong Voiceover Lien Mac, Kong Kia Muk, Va Dam Bao Ro De La Fictional Case de Tran Namlan Voisu Kien Ko that. Duoi De La PHN 1, 1400 to 1502. The night the town of Black Hollow stopped breathing began without warning, without sound, without anything that would later make sense in hindsight, as if the world itself had briefly forgotten how to witness what was about to happen, and in that silence a single house on the edge of Cedar Ridge Road became the center of a mystery that would swallow decades whole, a place where lights were seen flickering at 2:17 a.m., where a dog barked once and never again, where a neighbor would later swear. They heard a scream cut so sharply it felt almost mechanical, like something not entirely human had interrupted it mid-existence, and by morning there was nothing left inside that house except an open door swinging gently in the cold air and a dining table still set for a meal that was never finished. The first officer to arrive would describe the scene in words he later refused to repeat under oath, not because he was unsure of what he saw, but because certainty itself had become uncomfortable, invasive, something that did not belong in a place like that, where everything felt paused mid-motion, as if time had stepped away and forgotten to return, and what remained was a hallway leading into darkness that felt too deliberate to be empty, too arranged to be accidental, with a child's shoe lying precisely halfway between the staircase and the living room, as if placed there rather than dropped, as if someone had thought about where it should go after everything else was already over. Inside the house, there were signs of life that refused to explain themselves. A kettle still warm. A television left on static, whispering white noise into a room that no longer had anyone to listen. A photograph on the mantelpiece slightly tilted, showing a family smiling in a way that now felt like evidence rather than memory. And then there were the marks, subtle at first, easily missed if one wanted to miss them, but once noticed, impossible to unsee. A scrape along the hardwood floor leading toward the back door, faint impressions on the carpet suggesting weight, pressure, urgency, and something else that investigators at the time could not yet name without sounding reckless. The missing family, the Whitmores, were not the kind of people who vanished easily from memory. Daniel Whitmore, a mechanic with a reputation for fixing what others had already given up on, was known across 3 counties not just for his skill but for his predictability. He left work at the same time every day. He bought coffee from the same diner every morning at 6:40. He waved to the same crossing guard who later became one of the first witnesses interviewed. His wife, Marlene, worked part-time at the local library, where she organized books with a precision that mirrored her home life, everything catalogued, everything in its place. Their daughter, Elise, 12 years old, was described by teachers as quiet but observant, the kind of child who noticed details adults forgot to see. That was what made the absence so violent in its simplicity. Nothing about them suggested disappearance. Nothing about them suggested chaos. And yet chaos had arrived anyway, not as noise, not as spectacle, but as absence itself. By sunrise, Cedar Ridge Road was no longer just a street, it had become a perimeter of questions. Patrol cars lined the entrance like a wall of uncertainty. Neighbors gathered at distances that grew smaller every hour, drawn in by the same instinct that makes people look toward smoke even when they already know what fire looks like. Reporters arrived before forensic teams had fully mapped the scene, their cameras capturing glimpses of a story that had not yet decided what it wanted to be: kidnapping, escape, violence, or something else entirely unclassifiable. The first search of the property revealed nothing definitive, which in itself became its own kind of evidence. No forced entry in the traditional sense. No signs of struggle that matched expectations. No immediate trace of where 3 people could have gone without leaving a clearer signature of their departure. But there were inconsistencies, small fractures in the logic of the house, a basement door locked from the outside, a window slightly ajar despite the winter air, footprints that seemed to begin and end without a logical path connecting them. Investigators at the time would later admit that the early hours of the case felt less like solving a puzzle and more like trying to assemble one while parts were still being removed. Every conclusion collapsed under the weight of another observation. Every theory created a contradiction that made it weaker than the last. And then there was the detail that changed everything without announcing itself as important at first. A single burn mark on the edge of the kitchen counter, circular, deliberate, almost surgical in its placement. Not large enough to suggest an accident. Not random enough to be ignored. It would take weeks before anyone understood what it might mean, and even then, understanding would not bring clarity, only deeper unease. By the end of the first day, Black Hollow had already begun to divide itself into versions of the truth. One version said the Whitmores had been taken. Another said they had left willingly, though no one could explain why or how. A third, whispered only when no officials were listening, suggested that something had entered that house that night and that whatever left afterward was not the same thing that had lived there before. What no one could agree on was the timeline. Every witness account bent it in a different direction. The neighbor who heard the scream placed it at 2:15 a.m. The dog walker who passed the street insisted it was closer to 2:30. A delivery driver swore he saw headlights leaving the area at a speed that made no sense for the road conditions. These contradictions did not cancel each other out, they accumulated, building a structure of uncertainty so dense it became almost architectural. And somewhere within that structure, investigators would later realize, was the first sign that this case would not behave like others. Because most disappearances collapse under the weight of time, witnesses fade, evidence degrades, memory softens into ambiguity. But here, time did not weaken the mystery. It sharpened it. By the third day, the house on Cedar Ridge Road had been sealed, not as closure, but as containment. As if the place itself had become unstable, as if leaving it open to the world would allow whatever had happened inside to continue happening in some invisible form. Officers rotated shifts without speaking much about what they felt when they stood in the hallway, where the air seemed colder than the rest of the house by a degree no thermometer could properly justify. And still, no answers came. Only questions that began to change shape the longer they were examined, not who took the Whitmores, but what kind of presence could erase three people without leaving a signature that made sense to the systems designed to detect exactly that kind of absence. It would take years before anyone even began to ask the right questions. And by then, Black Hollow would no longer resemble the town it had been on the night everything stopped breathing. It would have learned to live with silence, not as peace, but as something heavier, something that stayed. And deep inside the sealed house on Cedar Ridge Road, long after the first investigators had moved on to other cases, a single unanswered detail remained waiting, patient, unresolved, and quietly resistant to time itself. Min se tip tuc piachen tu theo dung phong kak cinematic thriller hu kor, jayu mak lien mak va tang dan kang thang. The second week of the investigation did not bring clarity, it brought fragmentation, as if the case itself had begun to split into incompatible versions of reality, each one competing for authority, each one weakening the others, and in Black Hollow that meant something far more dangerous than confusion. It meant belief was beginning to fracture, neighbors no longer agreed on what they had seen, officers no longer agreed on what they had heard, and even the house on Cedar Ridge Road seemed to resist a single interpretation, shifting subtly depending on who stood inside it, like a place that refused to be fixed into a stable truth. Detective Rowan Hale arrived on day 9, transferred from a neighboring county after a series of unresolved disappearances had followed him like shadows that paperwork could not erase, a man known not for solving cases quickly, but for refusing to abandon them when others already had, and the moment he stepped inside the Whitmore residence he stopped speaking for almost a full minute, not out of hesitation, but because he was listening to something no one else in the room acknowledged, a kind of pressure in the air that felt almost rhythmic, almost intentional, like the house still had a pulse but no longer wanted it measured. Hale began where others had ended, the kitchen. The burn mark on the counter had been photographed, catalogued, and largely dismissed as incidental damage, but he studied it longer than anything else, circling it without touching it, as if proximity alone might reveal intention. The mark was too clean for accident, too centered for chaos. It suggested contact, but not impact. Duration, but not force. It implied something had been placed there, held there, removed carefully, and then never explained. In the living room, he noticed something others had recorded but not questioned: the television remote placed upside down on the armrest, not dropped, not abandoned, but oriented, as if its final position mattered. And beneath the coffee table, almost hidden in shadow, a faint indentation in the carpet that suggested repeated weight in the same position, as though someone had stood there long enough for the floor to begin remembering them. Outside the house, the narrative of the Whitmores had already begun to evolve into myth. In cafes and garages, people spoke in lowered voices about patterns that no official report confirmed. Some claimed Daniel Whitmore had been involved in something beyond his life as a mechanic, something that required silence more than skill. Others insisted Marlene had been planning to leave town, though no records supported travel or preparation. And Elise, the daughter, became the center of the most unstable theories. Because children in missing cases always do, they carry the emotional weight of uncertainty in ways adults cannot resist projecting onto. But Hale was not interested in theories yet. He was interested in structure. He requested the original timeline reconstruction, but instead of reading it, he reconstructed it again himself, comparing witness statements not for accuracy, but for deviation. He mapped every contradiction as if contradiction itself might reveal a hidden geometry. The scream at 2:15. The headlights at 2:30. The dog barking at a time no one agreed on. To most investigators, these were errors. To Hale, they were coordinates that refused alignment. On the 13th day, a new detail emerged from evidence storage, something that had been logged but never elevated in priority. Trace fibers found near the back door, synthetic, dark in color, inconsistent with anything in the Whitmore household. They were too few to identify a source, too degraded to match a database profile, but Hale insisted they be re-examined under different lighting conditions, different magnification, different assumptions. And it was under that second review that the fibers revealed something unsettling. They were not randomly scattered. They followed a directional flow, as if dragged, not dropped. That was also the day the basement door became significant. Originally, it had been recorded as locked from the outside, an unusual detail that had been noted but not fully explored due to lack of forced entry. But Hale questioned the logic of its classification. Locked by whom, and when? The key was never recovered. No duplicate was found in the house. And yet the mechanism showed no damage, no sign of manipulation, only closure. That meant intentional sealing, not obstruction. When the door was opened again under controlled conditions, the air that came out was noticeably colder than the rest of the house, a temperature drop that no ventilation explanation could fully justify, and for a moment the officers standing nearby instinctively stepped back, not because of smell or sight, but because of sensation, an instinctive recognition that something about the space below was not aligned with the space above. The basement itself contained nothing overtly dramatic: storage boxes, old furniture, seasonal items. But Hale noticed something immediately that others had overlooked in earlier searches. The dust patterns were inconsistent. Some areas showed long-term accumulation. Others appeared recently disturbed. And near the far corner, behind a stack of cardboard boxes, there was a patch of floor that had been wiped clean in a deliberate rectangular shape, too precise to be accidental cleaning, too isolated to be routine maintenance. That rectangle would later become one of the most discussed anomalies of the entire case. Because beneath it, there were microscopic traces of residue that did not belong to any household material, something organic but altered, something that suggested exposure to heat followed by rapid cooling, as if something had been removed before it could fully settle into its environment. But even that discovery did not bring resolution. It only expanded the question. By the end of the third week, the investigation had shifted from active search to controlled uncertainty. The Whitmores were still classified as missing, but the language around their disappearance had changed subtly in internal reports. Terms like unresolved absence, non-standard disappearance event, and incomplete trace recovery began to replace simpler categories. Language itself was adapting to the case. And in Black Hollow, people began to notice something else. The house on Cedar Ridge Road no longer felt empty in the same way it had at the beginning. Not occupied, not haunted in any theatrical sense, but unresolved, as if it had absorbed the moment of disappearance and refused to release it. Even at a distance, standing at the edge of the property line, some claimed they could feel it, a lingering imbalance, like a sentence that had stopped mid-word and was still waiting for completion. And somewhere within that unfinished sentence, Detective Rowan Hale began to suspect the most dangerous possibility of all, that the Whitmores had not simply vanished into absence, but into something structured enough to leave traces, and intelligent enough to hide what those traces meant. Min se tip tuc phn 3 theo dung form kak cinematic crime thriller hu kor, jayu nip kang thang va dong kulien mak. By the time the fourth week arrived, Black Hollow had stopped treating the Whitmore case as an investigation and started treating it as an atmosphere, something that could not be solved so much as endured, and that shift in perception changed everything, because once a case becomes atmosphere, it begins to seep into how people speak, how they remember, how they decide what is safe to say out loud, and Detective Rowan Hale could feel that shift every time he walked through town, the way conversations would pause just slightly too late, the way eyes would avoid his, not out of guilt, but out of fatigue, as if the disappearance had already consumed too much attention to give any more. The official report now carried classifications that had not existed in the early days: non-standard disappearance pattern, environmental inconsistency zone, and the most troubling of all, a term introduced by forensic analysts who refused to elaborate on its origin, behaviorally absent footprint. It was a phrase that sounded scientific but meant something far less comfortable, that the evidence did not behave like evidence was supposed to behave. Hale focused on the basement rectangle again, the clean, deliberate absence in the dust, and ordered a second forensic sweep with more sensitive instruments. What came back did not clarify the picture, it complicated it in a way that made several technicians request reassignment. The residue beneath the floor had trace elements consistent with organic matter exposed to extreme heat, but layered within it were microscopic metallic particles that did not match any household appliance, tool, or wiring in the building. It was as if something had occurred there that required conditions not naturally present in a residential home. And yet nothing had been recorded. No alarms. No emergency calls. No neighbors reporting unusual noise beyond the initial fragmented accounts. It was the kind of silence that felt curated, not accidental. That realization led Hale to revisit every witness statement again, but this time he did not read them as accounts of what happened, he read them as interruptions in continuity. The crossing guard who mentioned seeing Daniel Whitmore earlier than usual that morning. The delivery driver who insisted headlights were leaving the property at high speed. The neighbor who heard a scream that sounded too short, as if it had been cut before it could fully form. Each statement now felt less like testimony and more like fragments of a recording that had been partially erased. Then came the first anomaly that could not be dismissed as perception. A traffic camera located half a mile from Cedar Ridge Road had captured a brief, distorted sequence at 2:23 a.m. on the night of the disappearance. The footage was not clear enough to identify individuals, but it showed a brief fluctuation in light patterns along the road, something that resembled movement but did not behave like a vehicle or pedestrian. The system had flagged it as compression artifact, but Hale requested the raw data anyway. When analysts reprocessed it, the anomaly remained, shifting slightly in form but never resolving into anything identifiable. It was not proof of anything. But it was also not nothing. And in cases like this, not nothing was often the most dangerous category. By the end of that week, Hale began spending more time inside the Whitmore house alone. Officially, it was for observation. Unofficially, it was because the house seemed to change when fewer people were inside it. Sounds that had not been documented before began to emerge, not voices, not footsteps, but structural noises, the subtle contraction and expansion of wood, pipes, and air, except timed in a way that suggested rhythm rather than decay. On one of those nights, Hale stood in the hallway for nearly 20 minutes without moving, listening to what he later described only as interference, a low-frequency hum that seemed to come not from a source, but from the space between objects, as if the house itself was reacting to being observed. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came from something even smaller. A second search of Elise Whitmore's bedroom revealed a notebook that had previously been catalogued but not fully analyzed. Most of its pages contained typical adolescent writing, drawings, fragments of thoughts, incomplete sentences. But near the end of the notebook, there were repeated markings, simple geometric shapes, circles intersected by lines, drawn again and again with increasing pressure until the paper began to tear. At first, they were dismissed as meaningless. But Hale noticed something others had not. The shapes were not random. They appeared in sequences, repeated at intervals that matched specific times recorded in the investigation timeline. 2:15, 2:17, 2:23, the same cluster of times that had defined the earliest witness contradictions. It was impossible to say whether Elise had been recording something or anticipating it. And that uncertainty made the notebook more disturbing than any physical evidence in the house. Then, on the 29th day, something changed in the behavior of the case itself. A technician reviewing archived data noticed that certain timestamps in the original emergency response logs did not align with dispatch records. Not by minutes, but by seconds, small discrepancies that, individually, meant nothing, but collectively suggested a shift in recorded sequence. It was as if the order of events had been subtly rearranged after the fact. When Hale saw the report, he did not react immediately. He simply asked for every digital file associated with the case to be revalidated against original source backups. That request triggered a chain of discoveries no one had anticipated. Several files had undergone undocumented modification at the metadata level. Not deletion. Not corruption. Adjustment. Timestamps corrected, then corrected again, in patterns that suggested multiple revisions over time. And most unsettling of all, these changes were not recent. Some dated back to within days of the original investigation. Someone, or something, had been shaping the record while it was still being written. And that was when the investigation stopped feeling like it was following a disappearance. It started feeling like it was being guided away from something. Hale stood outside the Whitmore house that night, looking at the structure under weak streetlight, and for the first time since arriving in Black Hollow, he considered the possibility that the case was not resisting resolution because it was complex, but because it was active. Not alive. But active in the only way that mattered for something that wanted to remain unseen. It was still influencing what people could know. And somewhere inside that influence, buried beneath layers of silence, correction, and contradiction, the truth of what happened on Cedar Ridge Road was not waiting to be discovered. It was waiting to decide whether discovery was still possible at all. Min se teep tuc phn 4 theo dung form kak cinematic thriller hu kor, jayu nip lian mak va day muk kang thine glen cowhun. By the 30th day, Black Hollow was no longer simply a town orbiting a missing person case, it had become a place quietly reorganizing itself around a question no one wanted to articulate directly, because once spoken aloud it felt irreversible, and Detective Rowan Hale could sense that hesitation everywhere he went, in the way doors closed a fraction too early, in the way conversations ended just before his presence was acknowledged, in the way even the air seemed to avoid committing to stillness for too long, as if everything in the town had learned a new kind of caution. The updated forensic review arrived just after dawn, marked urgent not because of new evidence, but because of inconsistency in old evidence that had grown too large to ignore. Several timestamps from the initial 911 dispatch had shifted again during cross-verification, not reverting to earlier errors, but forming a third version of sequence entirely, one that matched neither the original logs nor the corrected archives. Analysts described it as temporal misalignment within recorded data, a phrase that no one liked using because it implied intent without admitting it. Hale requested a full reconstruction of the digital chain of custody. What came back was worse than corruption. It was structure. Multiple files showed signs of revision layered over revision, not overwritten in the traditional sense, but adjusted in narrow windows of time where metadata had been subtly rewritten without triggering system alarms. It was not hacking in the conventional understanding. There were no breaches, no external intrusion points, no obvious source. Instead, it resembled something internal, as if the system itself had participated in its own alteration without acknowledging it. And then came the most unsettling discovery. The first modification timestamp predated the official opening of the case file. Which meant the record had begun changing before anyone officially started writing it. Hale did not share that conclusion immediately. Instead, he returned to the Whitmore house alone again that evening, against recommendation, against protocol, against the growing unease of the department that had begun to treat him less like an investigator and more like a variable they could no longer fully account for. Inside the house, the atmosphere had changed in a way that defied explanation in physical terms. The temperature was the same. The structure unchanged. And yet the perception of space had shifted subtly, as if the rooms were no longer arranged for observation, but for recall, like something was being remembered rather than inhabited. He stood in the kitchen first, focusing again on the burn mark, but this time noticing something new around its edges, a faint secondary pattern, almost invisible unless viewed from a specific angle, like residue left by repeated contact rather than a single event. It suggested the mark was not an endpoint, but a point of repetition. In the living room, the indentation beneath the coffee table had deepened slightly since his last visit, or at least it appeared that way under shifting light. He knelt, studying it, and for the first time considered not what had stood there, but how long it had stood there without moving. Then he heard it. Not a sound from within the house, but something like a discontinuity in ambient noise, a brief interruption in the expected rhythm of silence. It lasted less than a second, but it forced him to stop breathing without conscious decision. It came again, irregular, not repeating in pattern but returning in proximity, as if the house itself was attempting to establish communication through absence rather than presence. He moved toward the hallway. The air changed as he crossed into it, not colder, not warmer, but denser, as if the space between molecules had become less willing to separate. At the midpoint of the corridor, where the child's shoe had originally been found, he noticed something that had not been recorded in any prior report, a faint discoloration along the baseboard, subtle enough to be dismissed as aging wood, but too linear to be natural wear. It traced a path. Not a movement path, but a boundary. And for the first time, Hale considered that the house might not be a static crime scene, but a mapped space, where certain areas had been deliberately defined as significant while others were allowed to decay into irrelevance. The basement door remained sealed in official procedure, but Hale had retained personal access authorization from an earlier override request that no one had challenged yet, perhaps because no one wanted to be responsible for what it might reveal. When he opened it this time, the cold was immediate, sharper than before, as if the air below had been compressed and stored. The staircase creaked in a way that suggested not age, but anticipation, each step responding slightly before he placed weight on it. At the bottom, the basement appeared unchanged at first glance. Boxes, furniture, dust, the familiar arrangement of abandonment. But the rectangular clean patch on the floor had expanded by a few centimeters in one direction, subtle enough that only precise comparison against previous photographs confirmed it. That was not possible. And yet it was there. Hale stood at the edge of it for a long moment before kneeling again, this time placing a gloved hand just above the surface, not touching it. The air above the rectangle felt different in temperature and resistance, like a boundary layer that separated two conditions of space. He withdrew his hand slowly, then looked upward at the ceiling. For a brief instant, so brief he would later question whether it occurred at all, the overhead light flickered without electrical fluctuation, as if responding to something not connected to power. And then, in the far corner of the basement, behind stacked boxes that had not been moved since the initial search, something fell softly onto the floor. Not dropped. Settled. Hale turned slowly, flashlight beam cutting across the darkness, revealing nothing immediately out of place except a single object that had not been there during any previous documented search, a small piece of folded material, pale, almost washed in color, lying precisely at the edge of visibility. He approached it carefully, as if proximity alone might change its state. It was paper. But not ordinary paper. Because when he picked it up, he realized it had been torn, not cut, and the tear pattern suggested it was once part of something larger that had been deliberately separated rather than accidentally damaged. On its surface were markings. Simple geometric shapes. Circles intersected by lines. The same patterns from Elise Whitmore's notebook. Only now they were arranged differently. As if rewritten. And that was when Hale understood, without yet having words for it, that whatever had happened in this house was not confined to a single night. It was continuing to organize itself through what remained of its traces. Min sa tip tuc pichen 5 theo dung mak cinematic thriller hu kor, jayu nip kang thang va tang kam jayak case dang fan hoi line goi dayu tra. By the 31st day, the investigation had stopped behaving like an extraction of truth and started behaving like a system of return, as if every action taken by Detective Rowan Hale was no longer moving the case forward but provoking it into responding in kind, and that realization did not arrive as a sudden revelation, but as a slow accumulation of uncomfortable coincidences that refused to stay isolated, because now every piece of evidence seemed to carry the suggestion that it had been placed not just to be found, but to be found at a specific moment. The folded paper retrieved from the basement had been sealed, catalogued, and sent for analysis, but before it even reached the lab, a preliminary scan revealed something that made the technician pause long enough to request a second confirmation. The ink composition did not match any known writing instrument in the Whitmore household inventory, yet it showed signs of aging inconsistent with its discovery timeline. It behaved, chemically, as if it had been exposed to air cycles for weeks, not hours. That contradiction alone would have been enough to stall other cases, but here it was just another layer added to a structure already refusing coherence. And then came the image reconstruction. Under enhanced imaging, the geometric patterns on the paper resolved into a sequence rather than a static design. Not random repetition, not artistic variation, but ordered progression. Each symbol appeared to lead into the next, forming a directional chain that suggested instruction rather than expression. When analysts overlaid the sequence with Elise Whitmore's notebook pages, the alignment was not exact, but disturbingly close, as if both sets of markings were derived from a shared source that neither document fully contained. Hale did not describe it as language, because language implies intent that can be decoded. This felt closer to structure without translation. That evening, he returned to the Whitmore house again, but this time he did not enter immediately. He stood outside for several minutes, observing the property from the edge of Cedar Ridge Road, noting something he had not consciously registered before. The house no longer looked abandoned in the same way it had during the first weeks. The stillness was different. Less like absence, more like containment. As if the structure had begun holding something in place rather than simply waiting to be understood. Inside, the air felt unchanged, yet the experience of moving through it was no longer consistent. Distances seemed subtly altered. Hallways felt longer when walked in one direction than the other. Doors appeared to align slightly differently depending on angle of approach. Nothing was visibly wrong, but perception itself had begun to lose reliability in small, accumulating increments. He tested it deliberately, marked his steps, measured time between rooms. The results should have been consistent. They were not. The discrepancy was small, fractions of seconds, minor spatial drift, but it repeated with enough consistency to form a pattern. And patterns, Hale knew, were never accidental in cases that resisted closure. In the kitchen, the burn mark had changed again. Not in size, not in shape, but in clarity. It was sharper now, edges more defined, as if the surface around it had been cleaned more carefully than before. He took photographs, compared them to previous images, and confirmed what he already suspected. The mark was not deteriorating over time. It was being maintained. That was the moment the case stopped feeling like an investigation entirely and began feeling like observation of a process that continued without external input. Then, without warning, the house reacted. It began subtly, as most impossible things do. A faint vibration through the floor, barely perceptible, like distant machinery adjusting itself. Then the sound of something shifting in the basement, not movement of objects, but rearrangement of pressure in space. Hale descended immediately, flashlight steady, but halfway down the stairs he realized the sound was not coming from below. It was coming from everywhere at once, diffused through structure rather than localized in origin. When he reached the basement, the rectangular clean patch on the floor had changed again. This time, it had not expanded. It had divided. A second shape now existed beside it, nearly identical in dimension but slightly offset, as if the original had been duplicated with intention but imperfect alignment. The air above both shapes felt different from the rest of the room, layered in a way that made depth difficult to judge accurately. And on the far wall, something new had appeared. Not physically attached, but visually present in a way that did not align with prior inspections, faint markings, similar to the paper symbols, arranged vertically as if they had been projected rather than drawn. They were not illuminated, yet they were visible, as though visibility itself had been altered locally. Hale did not speak. He did not move closer immediately. He simply observed the arrangement and understood, without yet articulating it internally, that this was no longer a static crime scene revisited by investigators. This was a site-generating output. And then came the second anomaly that confirmed what he had begun to suspect. His recorder, which had been running continuously since entering the basement, captured a sound that he did not remember hearing in real time. A voice-like distortion. Not clearly speech, but structured enough to suggest articulation. It lasted less than 2 seconds. But when he replayed it, the waveform analysis showed something impossible. The audio spike occurred before the moment of recording. Hale froze the playback. Listened again. Same result. The sound was not recorded after it happened. It was recorded before it happened. And in that inversion, something fundamental about the case shifted again, not in explanation, but in direction. Because now the evidence was not simply being found. It was arriving ahead of discovery. Hale stood in the basement for a long time after that, no longer focusing on the shapes, the floor, or the anomalies, but on the realization forming beneath all of them. Whatever had occurred in this house on the night the Whitmores disappeared was not a single event that left traces behind. It was an ongoing configuration that continued to adjust its own record. And somewhere in that adjustment, the boundary between what was missing and what was still occurring had begun to blur in a way that made both categories unreliable. Above him, the house remained silent. But silence, he now understood, was no longer evidence of absence. It was part of the mechanism. Why the 32nd day, the Whitmore investigation had crossed an invisible threshold that no official report would ever properly acknowledge, because there was no category for it, no procedural language capable of containing the idea that a case could begin to respond, and yet that was exactly what Detective Rowan Hale could no longer ignore, because the evidence was no longer simply changing in isolation, it was changing in relation to him, as if his presence inside the investigation had become part of the system being measured. It began with the files. The morning briefing included a standard data refresh, but when Hale opened the case archive, several entries had been subtly altered again, not in content this time, but in emphasis. Certain timestamps were now highlighted where they had not been before. Certain witness statements had been reordered within the log structure without triggering revision history alerts. It was the kind of modification that should not have been possible without administrative access, and yet there was no sign of breach, no external login, no internal authorization trail. And then Hale noticed something more personal. His own notes had been edited. Not rewritten. Not deleted. Adjusted. Single words shifted. Phrases subtly restructured. Observations he remembered writing in one tone now appeared in another, as if the intent behind them had been softened or redirected. At first, he considered the possibility of system error, memory misalignment, fatigue. But when he compared printed backups, the differences were undeniable. Someone, or something, was not only preserving the case. It was curating it. That realization changed the way he approached everything that followed. He stopped treating the Whitmore house as the sole location of interest and began mapping the investigation as a distributed environment, one in which evidence, documentation, and perception were all interconnected nodes. The result of that shift was immediate and unsettling. Every location tied to the case now showed minor inconsistencies upon re-examination. The diner where Daniel Whitmore had his routine coffee showed a discrepancy in opening hours recorded across 2 separate municipal logs. The library where Marlene Whitmore worked had an archived attendance sheet that did not match payroll records. Even the crossing guard's testimony contained subtle variation when compared across interview transcripts taken only days apart. Individually, each anomaly could be dismissed. Collectively, they formed something far more coherent than coincidence should allow. A pattern of controlled variation. That afternoon, Hale requested a full re-interview of the original witnesses. The department resisted, not openly, but through delay, reassignment, procedural hesitation, the quiet bureaucratic friction that appears when an investigation becomes uncomfortable to its own structure. Eventually, only one witness agreed to meet again, the delivery driver who had reported seeing headlights leaving Cedar Ridge Road around 2:30 a.m. The meeting took place in a neutral office, but from the moment it began, something was wrong. The driver, a man in his 40s with no prior indication of instability, repeated his original statement with precision. Same time. Same direction. Same speed. But when Hale asked him to describe what the headlights looked like, the man paused, not in confusion, but in conflict, as if retrieving the memory required passing through something obstructive. They were normal, the man said at first. Then he stopped. And corrected himself. Actually, I don't remember seeing the car. I remember remembering it. The sentence made no logical sense, and yet the man appeared certain of it. More certain than his previous testimony. When pressed further, he became visibly unsettled, insisting that his earlier statement had felt accurate at the time, but now seemed placed, like a detail he had access to rather than ownership of. Hale ended the interview early. Outside the building, he stood in silence for several minutes, realizing that witness memory was no longer simply unreliable, it was being influenced retroactively. And if memory could be adjusted after the fact, then the investigation itself was no longer anchored to a stable past. That night, he returned again to the Whitmore house, but this time he did not enter through the front door. He went directly to the basement. The descent felt different. Not physically, but structurally. Each step down seemed to carry delayed resistance, as if the staircase was not fully synchronized with his movement. When he reached the bottom, the air was heavier than before, layered in a way that made depth perception unstable. The rectangular shapes on the floor had changed again. There were now 3. Aligned in near symmetry, but not perfect symmetry. The spacing between them suggested intention without precision, like something attempting to replicate an idea rather than a physical object. The markings on the wall had also evolved, extending further across the surface, forming clusters that resembled branching logic rather than decoration. And then Hale saw something that did not belong to any prior report, any prior visit, or any known phase of the investigation. His own footprint. Fresh. In the dust. Perfectly aligned with where he was standing. But he had not moved yet. He looked down, then slowly stepped backward. The footprint remained. Identical in shape, depth, and orientation. As if it had been placed there in anticipation of his position rather than created by it. For the first time, Hale felt a shift that was not investigative but instinctive. Not fear exactly, but recognition that the system he was observing was no longer reacting to observation alone. It was predicting it. He raised his flashlight toward the ceiling. The light flickered once. Then stabilized. And in that brief instability, he heard it again. Not from the recorder this time. Directly. A sound structured enough to feel intentional, but too fragmented to resolve into language. It carried the same impossible quality as before, but now it was closer, more immediate, as if it was not being transmitted through time but through proximity. Hale did not speak. He simply stood still. And in that stillness, he understood the most dangerous implication yet. If the investigation could anticipate him, then his next steps were already part of it. And somewhere in the structure of Cedar Ridge Road, something was no longer waiting to be discovered. It was waiting for him to arrive where he had already been recorded. By the 33rd day, Detective Rowan Hale stopped trusting the order in which events were supposed to occur, because order itself had begun to feel like a suggestion rather than a rule, and the Whitmore case, which had once been anchored to a clear starting point, the night of disappearance, the empty house, the unanswered calls, was now behaving like something without a fixed entry or exit, as if it could be approached from multiple directions in time and still produce the same unsettling result. It began with repetition. Not dramatic repetition, not obvious déjà vu, but subtle structural echoes that only became visible when compared side by side. A phrase in a witness transcript appearing in a different interview days later. A timestamp shifting just enough to overlap with another event that had previously been considered unrelated. Even Hale's own movements inside the Whitmore house seemed to carry faint repetition markers, as if the building itself was reusing spatial sequences without fully acknowledging it. At first, he assumed fatigue. Then he assumed data corruption. Then he stopped assuming anything at all. Because the pattern persisted even when systems were isolated, even when records were manually reconstructed from offline backups. The same inconsistencies reappeared, not as copies, but as reintegrations, like the case was rebuilding itself from a template that existed outside documentation. That morning, Hale requested a full chronological collapse analysis, an attempt to reconstruct the entire investigation into a single linear sequence, stripped of interpretation. The results did not stabilize the timeline. They destabilized it further. Analysts found that multiple key events aligned perfectly when reordered differently. The scream reported by neighbors at 2:15 a.m., the headlights at 2:30, the emergency dispatch at 2:41, all of them could be arranged into at least 3 internally consistent sequences, each one contradicting the others, yet each one mathematically coherent when isolated. It was as if time itself was offering alternative narratives. And none of them agreed on what had actually happened. Hale did not share the report. Instead, he returned to the Whitmore house alone again, ignoring the growing resistance from the department, which had begun to frame his continued involvement less as dedication and more as instability. By now, Cedar Ridge Road had become less of a crime scene and more of a restricted anomaly zone in practice, if not in official language. Inside the house, the first thing he noticed was wrong was not visual. It was temporal rhythm. The silence no longer held consistent duration. Moments of stillness stretched and contracted unpredictably, as if the house was no longer measuring time uniformly. He tested it by standing in the hallway and counting seconds between distant structural sounds. The intervals did not repeat. They varied in patterns that suggested not randomness, but modulation. Then he heard footsteps. Not his own. Above him. Slow. Deliberate. Crossing the second floor. Hale froze, listening carefully. The house had been empty according to all confirmed access logs. No one had entered. No one had exited. And yet the footsteps continued, moving from one room to another with a familiarity that suggested memory rather than intrusion. He ascended cautiously. Each step upward felt slightly misaligned with the last, as if the staircase was not maintaining consistent geometry. When he reached the upper floor, the hallway appeared unchanged at first glance, but the air carried a subtle difference, warmer near the bedroom doors, colder near the bathroom, as if thermal distribution had been reorganized according to unseen criteria. The footsteps stopped. Then resumed. Inside Elise Whitmore's room. Hale approached slowly, hand near his flashlight switch, though he was already using it. The door was slightly ajar, a detail he was certain had not been present during his last visit. He pushed it open. The room was empty. But not unchanged. The notebook lay open on the bed. Even though he was certain he had previously secured it as evidence. The pages were no longer static. The geometric markings had expanded again, forming new sequences that had not been present in prior documentation. But what drew his attention most was not the symbols themselves, it was their orientation. They were no longer aligned to the page margins. They were aligned to something else. To his position in the room. Hale stepped forward, and as he did, the symbols subtly shifted. Not physically moving, but appearing differently depending on angle. Like a system responding to observation rather than existing independently of it. He closed the notebook immediately. And in that moment, the footsteps returned. Closer this time. From directly behind him. Hale turned instantly. Nothing. Empty hallway. But the sound remained, now overlapping itself, as if multiple instances of the same movement were occurring at slightly different moments in time. Then came the most disturbing realization yet. His radio, clipped to his vest, activated on its own. Static. Then a fragment of sound. Not speech clearly, but structured enough to suggest repetition of something previously heard. He recognized it instantly. The same distorted audio from the basement recording. But this time it was not delayed. It was live. Hale stepped backward into the hallway, eyes scanning for movement, but the house offered none. Instead, it offered consistency, breaking apart at the edges, light flickering in patterns that did not correspond to electrical load, shadows shifting in ways that did not match light source position. And then, for the first time, he understood what the repetition meant. It was not duplication. It was revision. The house was not replaying events. It was rewriting them in place. And he, by remaining inside it, was being included in the rewrite process. Hale left the room immediately, descending the stairs faster now, urgency overriding caution. But halfway down, he stopped. Because at the bottom of the staircase, in the exact position where he would have stepped next, there was already a footprint. Fresh. Facing upward. Waiting. As if the outcome of his descent had already been recorded. And in that moment, Hale realized the most dangerous truth the Whitmore case had revealed so far. He was no longer investigating a disappearance. He was moving through a sequence that had already been written with him inside it. By the 34th day, Detective Rowan Hale understood that the Whitmore case no longer behaved like a contained investigation, because containment implies boundaries, and boundaries imply something exists outside them, but Cedar Ridge Road had stopped offering any reliable distinction between inside and outside, as if the entire environment had been rewritten into a closed system that expanded perception but refused exit. The decision to leave the house that night did not feel like a choice so much as a test. Hale moved quickly down the staircase, each step now carrying an echo that arrived slightly before his foot touched the wood, a delay inversion that made motion feel preemptively confirmed, as if the outcome of movement existed before movement itself. The footprint at the base of the stairs remained where he had seen it earlier, but now there were more marks surrounding it, subtle additions that suggested repeated arrivals and departures he did not remember performing. He reached the front door. Unlocked. He was certain it had been secured. That was the first contradiction. The second came when he stepped outside. The air should have felt different. Cooler. Open. Unstructured. Instead, it felt calibrated, like the interior atmosphere had simply extended beyond the threshold without interruption. The boundary between house and street was no longer defined by physical separation but by continuity. Cedar Ridge Road was empty. No patrol cars. No neighboring lights. No distant movement. Not unusual at night, but this absence felt staged in a way that was difficult to articulate. Even the ambient noise of the town seemed reduced to a uniform baseline, as if sound itself had been compressed. Hale walked to his vehicle. It was there. But something was wrong. The positioning was identical to how he had left it, yet the angle relative to the house appeared subtly altered. He paused, studying it, then checked his watch. The time displayed was consistent with his last confirmed reading. But when he compared it to his internal sense of duration, something did not align. He had spent longer inside the house than the timeline allowed. That discrepancy should have been impossible. He opened the car door. Sat inside. Turned the ignition. The dashboard lights activated normally. But the radio immediately emitted static. Not unusual in itself. Until a fragment of sound broke through. A familiar distortion. The same pattern recorded in the basement. Hale turned the volume down instantly, but the sound did not stop. It continued beneath the suppression, as if it was not being transmitted through the system but generated alongside it. He shut the engine off. Silence returned. But it was not the same silence as before. It felt aware. Hale stepped out of the vehicle again. And that was when he noticed it. The Whitmore house was no longer behind him. At least not in the position it should have been. He turned slowly. Cedar Ridge Road extended in both directions, but the house was absent from the expected location. Instead, there was only an empty stretch of property line, unmarked, unoccupied, as if the structure had never existed in that spatial coordinate. Hale walked back a few steps. Then forward again. No change. The house was gone. And yet, his notes, his equipment, his recordings, all of them still indicated continuous proximity to it. That contradiction did not register as fear immediately. It registered as classification failure. He opened his case recorder. The last entry was still running. Timestamp active. Audio active. Location tag, Cedar Ridge Road. But visual confirmation no longer matched system data. Hale replayed the last recorded segment. His own footsteps descending the stairs. The footprint at the base. The door opening. Then. A gap. Not silence. A missing interval. A segment that existed in metadata but not in playback. He rewound. Played again. Same absence. And in that absence, something changed in his understanding of the case. Because now it was not just that time was unstable. It was that the record of time was selective. Certain moments were retained. Others were omitted. Not erased. Excluded. Hale closed the recorder. Looked around again. The road remained empty. But now he understood something more precise than before. He had not left the Whitmore house. He had transitioned out of its observable layer. And whatever system governed the case had not finished with him. It had simply stopped rendering the context he expected to exist inside. Then, from somewhere behind him. A sound. Not footsteps this time. A static pulse. Close enough that it felt spatial, not auditory. Hale turned instantly. Nothing visible. But the radio in his car, still open, powered itself on again. And this time, the distortion resolved slightly more clearly than before. Not into speech. But into structure. Repeating. Aligning. Matching the same geometric rhythm found in Elise Whitmore's notebook. And as Hale stood there, isolated on a road that no longer contained its central location, he realized the most unsettling possibility yet. The case was not expanding. It was compressing perception around him. And he was no longer moving through it. He was being positioned inside it. By the 35th day, Detective Rowan Hale stopped trying to locate the Whitmore house in physical space, because physical space no longer behaved like a reliable reference frame, and instead he began focusing on something far more unsettling. The realization that every attempt to observe the case was not clarifying it, but altering it, as if attention itself had become an active force inside the structure he was trying to understand. The road around Cedar Ridge remained unchanged in form, yet unstable in meaning. Hale walked its length again and again, measuring distance not with steps but with repetition, testing whether return points aligned with previous trajectories. They did not. Each pass produced subtle drift, not in terrain, but in expectation. Landmarks felt familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, as if memory was being rewritten in parallel with perception. His recorder remained active. It had not stopped since the basement. And now it no longer behaved like a passive device. It reacted. Every time Hale paused to observe a specific point, an empty stretch of road, a patch of grass, a distant tree line, the audio feed would adjust, introducing faint structural noise, as if the system was acknowledging that observation had occurred. When he stopped focusing, it stabilized again. It was not recording events anymore. It was responding to attention. That realization changed everything about how he moved. He stopped looking directly at anything for too long. But even that did not help. Because the environment had already adapted. At approximately what should have been midday, though time had become unreliable, Hale noticed a shift in ambient consistency. Shadows no longer corresponded correctly with light direction. Temperature variations occurred without environmental cause. Even the wind seemed to arrive in patterns that suggested repetition rather than weather. And then came the second anomaly. His field notes. The physical notebook he had been carrying since the beginning of the case. When he opened it, several pages had changed. Not rewritten in his handwriting style. Not replaced. Reorganized. Entire sections had been reordered so that conclusions appeared before observations, and observations appeared without context. Some entries referenced events he had not yet experienced in his personal timeline, including details that should not have been accessible. One line stood out. It was written in his own handwriting. But he did not remember writing it. It said only, "Observation precedes occurrence." Hale closed the notebook immediately. And for the first time, He considered not the possibility that time was unstable, but that narrative structure itself had become primary. Not events, but the act of recording them. As if the case existed most strongly in the moment it was being described. He looked up. The road ahead seemed unchanged. But something about it felt thinner, as if it could not fully commit to continuity. Then the radio in his vehicle activated again without input. Static first. Then a pattern. More stable than before. More deliberate. The geometric rhythm had evolved. It was no longer random repetition. It was sequence. And within that sequence, Hale recognized something that made his stomach tighten, not because it was meaningful in isolation, but because it resembled alignment. Like instructions. Or calibration. He turned the radio off manually. Silence returned. But only for a moment. Because now the sound was no longer dependent on the device. It was present in the environment itself. Not loud. Not directional. Just persistent enough to be unavoidable once noticed. Hale stopped walking. And in that stillness, something shifted again. The air ahead of him, roughly where the Whitmore house should have existed in relational memory, if not physical space, began to feel denser. Not visible. Not forming. But implied. As if the structure of the case had a center that was no longer anchored to geography, but to awareness. Hale slowly extended his hand toward that empty space. No contact. No resistance. But a sensation occurred anyway. A subtle mismatch in expectation, like touching something that responded without moving. He withdrew his hand immediately. And that was when he understood the fourth stage of the investigation not as a theory, but as a functional shift in how the case behaved. It did not require location anymore. It required recognition. The more it was recognized, the more it organized itself. And somewhere within that organization, the Whitmore disappearance was no longer a single unresolved event. It was a continuously updating structure that adapted to every attempt to define it. Hale stepped backward. And for the first time since arriving in Black Hollow, he considered the possibility that leaving was no longer an external action. It was an internal permission the case might not grant. The radio pulsed once more from inside the vehicle, even though it remained powered off. One final sequence. Clearer than ever before. And this time, beneath the geometric rhythm, there was something almost interpretable. Not words. But intent. And it felt, unmistakably, like acknowledgement. By the 36th day, Detective Rowan Hale no longer trusted the idea that he was moving forward through the Whitmore case, because the concept of forward itself had begun to lose structural meaning, replaced instead by something cyclical, something recursive, as if every action he took was not progressing the investigation but re-entering it from a slightly altered angle, and the most disturbing part was that each return felt convincing enough to disguise itself as first contact. He noticed it first in his own memory. Small inconsistencies that should not have existed if time were stable. He remembered opening the field notebook in one sequence of events, yet the physical record suggested he had already written in it before that moment. He recalled turning off the radio in the vehicle, but the logs indicated it had been off prior to his arrival at the car. Even his recollection of walking along Cedar Ridge Road began to feel layered, as if multiple versions of the same walk were occupying the same mental space, competing for authority without any clear winner. At first, he attempted to correct it through documentation. He rewrote timelines, reconstructed sequences, aligned timestamps against physical observation. But every correction only deepened the contradiction. Because the more he attempted to stabilize the narrative, the more the narrative itself seemed to anticipate his adjustments. It was not resisting him anymore. It was integrating him. That realization became unavoidable when he reviewed footage from his own body camera. The recording showed him standing still in the middle of Cedar Ridge Road. Then walking. Then standing again in the same position, but without any recorded transition between states. A missing segment. Not corrupted. Absent. And in that absence, something had been recorded that he did not remember experiencing. A pause in motion where motion should have existed. Hale replayed it again and again. Same result. Same gap. Same impossibility. And then he understood what had been happening since the beginning of the case. It was not that time was broken. It was that continuity was optional. Later that night, he returned once more to the point where the Whitmore house had ceased to appear consistently in physical space. The road was quiet, unchanged in its emptiness, yet that emptiness no longer felt like absence. It felt like a maintained condition, something actively preserved rather than naturally occurring. He stopped walking and stood still. And this time, instead of searching for anomalies in the environment, he focused on himself as the variable. Immediately, the radio in his vehicle activated without power. Static. Then the pattern again. But now it was different. More structured. More complete. The geometric rhythm that had evolved over the previous days had reached a level of complexity that no longer felt random or mechanical. It resembled coordination. And within it, Hale began to recognize repetition not as duplication, but as positioning. As if each sequence was guiding something toward alignment. Or returning something to alignment. Then came the realization that fractured his remaining certainty. The pattern was not progressing. It was looping. Not in space. But in him. He checked his notebook again. Another change. New entries had appeared. Written in his handwriting. But describing actions he had not yet taken in his current awareness. Including one line that chilled him more than anything before. You will notice this again before you understand it. Hale closed the notebook slowly. And for the first time, he did not attempt to correct the record. Instead, he tested something else. He repeated an action deliberately. He turned around. Walked 10 steps. Stopped. Then turned around again. The environment responded immediately. Not visually. But structurally. The sense of progression collapsed into familiarity. The same position. The same road alignment. The same silence. Identical to before. Except now he was certain he had already performed this exact sequence. More than once. He looked at his watch. Time had not advanced as expected. Or perhaps it had advanced too many times at once. And then, somewhere in the distortion of repetition, a thought formed that did not feel like his own but also did not feel separate. This is not the first iteration. Hale stood still for a long time. And in that stillness, the Whitmore case no longer felt like an investigation that had gone wrong. It felt like a process that refused completion because completion would break its function. And he, without knowing when it began, had become part of that function. Not an observer. Not even a participant. But a reference point the system kept returning to ensure consistency. Or correction. Or something he did not yet have language to define. Behind him, the road remained empty. But the silence was no longer neutral. It was maintaining him. By the 37th day, Detective Rowan Hale made a decision that felt less like intention and more like pressure finally reaching its limit, because if the Whitmore case was a loop, then the only remaining variable worth testing was rupture, and rupture meant forcing the system to behave in a way it had not yet accounted for, even if that meant breaking the only remaining sense of continuity he had left. He stopped repeating patterns. Stopped rechecking coordinates. Stopped relying on memory as validation. Instead, he moved in contradiction. If the case expected him to return to Cedar Ridge Road, he deliberately avoided it. If the recording suggested he had already performed an action, he refused to acknowledge its prior existence. Every instinct told him this was wrong, because every investigative framework he had ever used depended on consistency, but consistency itself had become unreliable, and so he replaced it with refusal. For several hours, nothing changed. Then the environment began to resist. Not violently. Subtly. At first, it was time. Clocks in different systems stopped agreeing with each other again, but this time the divergence was sharper, more focused, as if the discrepancy was centering on him specifically. Then came spatial drift. Landmarks that should have been fixed began appearing in incorrect relational positions, not randomly displaced, but selectively rearranged in ways that suggested prioritization. And finally, the radio in his vehicle activated once more. But this time, the pattern did not begin with static. It began immediately with structure. Fully formed. As if no transition was needed anymore. Hale stopped the car. And listened. The sequence was no longer fragmented or evolving. It was complete. And within that completion, something had changed. Because now, embedded in the rhythm, there was a stability that had never been present before. Not noise. Not distortion. But resolution. And that was when he realized the mistake in his strategy. The system was not resisting him. It was accommodating deviation. Every contradiction he introduced was being absorbed and integrated, not rejected. Every refusal to follow prior behavior was being mapped and stored as an alternative branch within the structure. Instead of breaking the loop, he had expanded it. And in expanding it, he had revealed its full range. He turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The road was no longer Cedar Ridge Road in any meaningful sense. It had become a transitional space, stripped of stable reference points. The sky above was unchanged, but its relationship to the ground felt misaligned, as if orientation itself had lost agreement with gravity. Hale walked forward. And this time, there was no sense of return. Only continuation. After what could have been minutes or hours, he reached a point where the environment changed without transition. Not gradually. Instantly. The Whitmore house was there. Not emerging. Not appearing. Simply present, as if it had always been occupying that exact position and perception had only just been corrected. Hale stopped. He did not move immediately. Because this time, the house did not feel like a site of disappearance. It felt like a stabilized output. A final state. He approached slowly. The front door was open. Not forced. Not ajar. Open in a way that suggested invitation without intention. Inside, everything was intact. But not unchanged. The arrangement of objects had reached a level of coherence that felt unnatural in its precision. The living room furniture was aligned in angles that corresponded not to comfort or use, but to geometry. The kitchen surface reflected light in patterns too controlled to be incidental. Even the air felt segmented, divided into zones of differing pressure and clarity. Hale moved through it carefully. And then he saw it. The basement door. Already open. He descended without hesitation this time. Because hesitation no longer affected outcome. At the bottom, the room was no longer a space of anomalies. It was a convergence point. All previous markings, the rectangles, the symbols, the shifting floor patterns had merged into a single coherent structure covering the entire basement floor. Not overlapping. Not layered. Unified. And in the center of it all, there was something new. A space that did not reflect light correctly. Not an object. Not an absence. A condition. Hale stepped closer. And as he did, the recorder in his vest activated one final time. No static. No delay. Just the complete sequence. The same pattern he had been hearing since the beginning. Except now it was synchronized perfectly with his own heartbeat. And in that synchronization, Hale understood the final implication. The case was no longer generating data about the Whitmore disappearance. It was generating him as part of its structure. Not as investigator. Not as witness. But as the mechanism by which the event remained unresolved. And as he stood in the center of the basement, surrounded by a system that no longer distinguished between observation and participation, the last remaining question was no longer what happened to the Whitmores. It was whether anything outside the system still existed at all. By the 38th day, Detective Rowan Hale understood that endings were not something the Whitmore case contained, because endings require separation, and nothing inside Cedar Ridge Road had ever been truly separate from anything else, not space, not time, not observation, not memory, and certainly not him, standing now in the center of the basement where every previous version of the investigation seemed to converge without contradiction, as if all possible outcomes had been folded into a Single condition that simply continued existing without permission to conclude. The structure on the floor no longer shifted. It no longer responded. It no longer evolved. It had stabilized. And in that stability, there was something far more unsettling than change. There was completion without resolution. Hale looked around the basement slowly, not searching for anomalies anymore, but for boundaries. There were none that held. The walls did not feel like containment. The ceiling did not feel like separation. Even the air seemed distributed evenly across something larger than the room itself, as if the entire house had ceased to function as a location and had become instead a localized expression of a system that extended beyond perception. The recorder in his vest remained active. But it no longer felt like a device. It felt like alignment. The geometric sequence that had been present since the earliest recordings was now fully synchronized with his presence, no longer playing alongside him but through him, as if his own biological rhythm had been absorbed into its structure without resistance. Hale did not try to stop it. Because stopping no longer had a defined effect. Instead, he focused on understanding what remained. And that was when the final realization formed not as a thought, but as an acknowledgement already embedded in everything he had experienced up to this point. The Whitmore disappearance had never been an event. It had been a system of persistence. Something that required continuity of observation to remain unresolved. And every investigator who entered it did not move closer to solving it. They became part of its maintenance. Hale closed his eyes. Not in surrender. Not in acceptance. But in recognition of structure finally completing its cycle. And in that moment, the basement changed one last time. Not visually. Not physically. But categorically. Because the space he was standing in was no longer recording him as an external observer. It was recording him as a stable component of the original condition. The missing family. The inconsistencies. The loops. The revisions. The footprints that arrived before movement. The voice that preceded recording. All of it was no longer pointing toward an answer. It was pointing toward continuity. And Hale, Detective Rowan Hale, was not outside that continuity. He never had been. Above him, somewhere beyond the limits of Cedar Ridge Road, the world continued as if nothing had changed. As if the Whitmore case was still an open file. Still unresolved. Still being investigated. Because it was. And it would remain so. As long as there was someone to observe it. The recorder emitted one final pulse. Not sound. Not data. Just acknowledgement. Then it stopped. And for the first time since the beginning of the investigation, there was absolute silence. Not absence. Not emptiness. But completion of function. And in Black Hollow, though no official record would ever reflect it, though no report would ever finalize it, the Whitmore case continued to exist exactly as it always had. Unsolved. Active. And quietly sustained by the very act of being remembered. There was no official closure to the Whitmore case. No final report. No press conference. No confirmed resolution filed in any system that could be publicly accessed. And yet, in the months that followed, the investigation did not disappear. It simply stopped being located in any single place. The Cedar Ridge Road site in Black Hollow was eventually marked as inactive, then reclassified, then quietly removed from public mapping systems without explanation. Locals would still refer to it in fragments of conversation, but when prompted for specifics, details would blur, as if collective memory itself refused to stabilize around it. Detective Rowan Hale was officially recorded as having left the investigation. No forwarding assignment. No retirement statement. No internal disciplinary action. Just a gap in administrative continuity that no one in the department could fully account for, though most assumed it was simply procedural loss, the kind that accumulates in long bureaucratic systems when files become too complex to maintain consistent narrative tracking. But there was one anomaly that never resolved. The case archive. In every version of the database, across mirrored backups and secured offline records, the Whitmore file remained active. Not open. Not closed. Active. Its last update timestamp did not correspond to any recorded human input. And its status field remained unchanged. Investigation ongoing. Years later, a junior analyst reviewing cold file inconsistencies would attempt to trace the origin of the Whitmore entry, expecting to find a standard chain of custody, a starting report, an initiating officer, a documented crime scene classification. But the archive behaved strangely when accessed. Certain metadata fields would populate only when viewed under specific system conditions. Certain witness statements would appear only when cross-referenced with unrelated cases. And, most disturbingly, one section of the file, labeled simply Field Observation Log, contained entries written in handwriting that had been digitized but never attributed. The analyst would later describe the moment of realization as a correction that felt like recognition. Because among the entries, there was a repeated pattern. Not of evidence. Not of conclusions. But of presence. And at the very end of the log, beneath pages that seemed to extend beyond their expected length, there was a final line. One that did not appear in all versions of the file, but only in some, depending on when and how the archive was accessed. It read, "You are closer than the last one. No signature. No timestamp. No indication of authorship. Just continuation." And somewhere, in a version of the system no longer clearly distinguishable from memory or record, the Whitmore case remained exactly as it had always been since the night it began. Not solved. Not forgotten. But still being observed. And still, quietly, observing back.